you the quantum mechanics?
Yes, we are the Quantum Mechanics, the paranormal podcast for the believers, the doubters, and everybody in between.
It's cold out here,
isn't it? It's really cold. It's really cold. I just came over in, I would say, the iciest conditions so far, and it's getting slightly slippy. I can see all the frost behind you.
And it's, when I woke up this morning, it was -4. I mean, that's Celsius for those in the States, so not as drastic as it might sound, but I don't think it's got above freezing all day, so yeah.
No, it hasn't at all. And it's one of those colds. I mean, there'll be people who are listening in much colder parts of the world who are poo-pooing
laughing at us.
They're laughing at us, but it's one of those where you go outside and even the dog's like, do you know what?
Yeah.
Just turn around and go back, please. Don't want
it's
this.
funny, my partner took our dog for a walk yesterday. They got about a quarter of the normal route and it just turned around and went, we're going home. Enough.
It is too much. It's too much. On their little paws.
You could say, Ben, it's as cold as the grave.
I was wondering who was going to be the first person to do the segue. As cold as the grave. Yes, it is.
It is. Well, let's get into the episode. So this started for me by watching Mark Kermode, you know, the film critic.
I do.
He was talking about the new movie adaptation by Robert Eggers of the vampire classic Nosferatu, which is just out.
Oh, is it? I wondered why there was lots of chatter about that.
Yeah, apparently it's really good, really amazing from what I've heard. Well, Mark Kermode likes it, which is always a good sign. But while he was doing his review of the movie, he mentioned legal disputes between the makers of the original 1922 movie of Nosferatu and the estate of Bram Stoker.
So I believe, and I didn't hear him talk about this, that Bram Stoker's wife got some money.
Well, it's funny because I hadn't really heard about this story, so I thought, and they didn't really go into detail of it on the Mark. I think it's called. I can't remember what their podcast is called, but anyway, they didn't go into much detail about it. They just mentioned it, so I did some digging. Now, the legal dispute between the 1922 film Nosferatu and the Bram Stoker estate centred around copyright infringement. Nosferatu was directed by F.W. Murnau, was deemed an unauthorised adaptation of Stoker's novel Dracula. The Stoker estate filed a lawsuit against the filmmakers, claiming that Nosferatu improperly used the characters and story elements from Dracula without permission. This is really, and I didn't know this bit, in 1925, the court ruled in favour of the Stoker estate, declaring that Nosferatu had infringed on their copyright. The court ordered that all copies of the film be destroyed.
Oh, right. I didn't know that.
I don't know if money changed hands as well, but definitely all copies of it were supposed to have been destroyed. Luckily, for movie buffs, it wasn't. Some prints survived. And Nosferatu became a significant work in the history of cinema. Classic of the horror genre. Kind of silent, probably one of the first major horror movies. But I guess the case highlighted the importance of copyright in the film industry, set a precedent for future adaptations of literary works. Shall we have a quick look at the similarities between Bram Stoker's story of Dracula and the 1922 film Nosferatu? You can see why the lawsuit happened. Both feature a vampire character, Count Orlok in Nosferatu, who pretty much mirrors the characteristics of Count Dracula from Stoker's novel.
I was going to say, I think one of the distinguishing... the reason that the judge ruled in that favour was because there was something in the court where he asked them to read out the description of the vampire in Dracula and then ask the jury whether they agree that accurately depicted the
Count
Nosferatu.
Orlok.
Count Orlok. Yeah, and they agreed it did.
Well, both stories also revolve around a vampire's journey to prey on a young woman, Mina Harker in Dracula, and Ellen, who's Hunter's wife in Nosferatu. Both narratives include settings that evoke a sense of gothic horror, such as an eerie Transylvanian castle, which has now become a stereotype, and moving to urban locations that became impacted by the vampire's presence. So they both feature that. Both stories reflected the societal cultural anxiety of the Victorian era. I guess many movies could do that. Both involve a journey from the vampire's domain to the modern world, highlighting the clash between ancient evil and contemporary society. So there are lots of parallels. And certainly it feels like Bram Stoker's novel at least influenced Nosferatu, even if you're not going to say it kind of ripped it off. And that got me thinking about what influenced Bram Stoker to create Dracula in the first place. I mean, I was struck by how much of modern vampire lore seems to centre around the world and the characters Bram Stoker created in some sense. But Bram Stoker didn't just pick Dracula out of thin air. And it led me to an interesting book by a professor of English literature called Nick Broom. The book is titled The Vampire, A New History, and it mainly focuses on vampire lore that predates Bram Stoker's classic novel. I thought that might be able to itch a scratch that I've had, because in my mind I always sit there and go, well, how much of this vampire lore is Bram Stoker and how much of it actually happened beforehand? While most accounts of the vampire, Broom writes, tend to focus on Bram Stoker's supernatural thriller Dracula, released in 1897 or published, and horror film sensation of the 20th century, over a century and a half before Dracula landed at Whitby, vampires were already challenging conventional attitudes. I argue, he says, that the vampire is a recognisable thing that dates from a precise period in a certain place and which consequently has recognisable manifestations and qualities, especially concerning blood, science, society and culture. Although vampires may have their origins in the opaque chronicles of assorted folklore beliefs, they only become vampires when they enter the European bloodstream as vampires, rather than as part of a general pantheon of the undead, many of whom, ghosts, ghouls, revenants, have displayed their taste for blood for centuries. But they are not vampires, he says.
Right, okay, so he's coming up with, I suppose, a definitive explanation of what a vampire is defined by.
Yeah, and how it almost, in my mind, how it was born out of folklore, not necessarily is folklore. That maybe becomes a bit clearer as we go on through this episode.
Yeah, because, so from my knowledge and preconceptions, every vampire that we see in modern culture, sort of, well, I'm talking about ones that appear in Scooby-Doo.
Yep.
Ones that appear in fancy dress shops around Halloween.
Yep.
They all have this collar come up. And I do know, interestingly, that all comes about from the stage play. I think we've discussed this before, the stage play of Dracula.
Yeah.
And so that can be traced back, as can the hair on the vampire, which goes back to the original guy who played it.
Yeah.
So there's quite a lot of
And aristocracy.
Aristocracy, yes.
The count.
The count.
The aristocrat.
Count backwards.
Yeah.
That's very good. But all of that, and then people have tried to sort of pull away from that with things like Twilight series and whatever.
Yeah, True Blood.
True Blood. I mean, I didn't realise Twilight was written as fanfic for 50 Shades. I had no idea that's what it was.
Right.
Which sort of makes sense. And then there's kind of like this underground sort of cosplaying vampire thing at the moment, which is based around, I guess, control play and less about mythology and the vampire lore. That's where I'm coming at it from.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good summary of kind of where we're at. And it reminds me of a quote, I can't remember who it's from in the book, which the author slightly dismisses, but it stuck with me. So every generation gets the vampire they deserve or want.
Oh, okay.
Which there is a certain truth to that. But anyway, Broom argues, the author, that if you believe the vampire begins with Dracula, you're ignoring 2 centuries where vampire lore really took hold. Now let's look at some of the early writing on vampires and some factors that may have influenced the legend. All these predate Dracula, the novel. Mm-hmm. So in 1734, Michael Ramft released the earliest compendium of vampirism. I don't know what's in it, but it sounds interesting. I want to read it now. The earliest recorded blood transfusions received by Arthur Koger from a sheep.
Ooh, that can't have gone well.
No, I think there's quite a lot about blood transfusions in the book between animals and humans. I would say it doesn't go well.
No. I did tell you, didn't I, when I found out from my dog, by the way, the vet told me the first transfusion into a dog, they can have it from a horse. In fact, they can have it from a human. They can have it from almost anywhere. But the second one, no.
Yes, I remember you saying that on the podcast.
Yeah.
Maybe the last time we talked about vampires, actually, you mentioned that.
I was fascinated by this.
That is really interesting.
If you live in the outback and you can't get near a vet, a valid thing you can do if your dog needs it is give him some of or her some of your own blood.
But it's a one-time only deal.
It's a one-time only deal, yeah. Because my dog had to wear an identifier saying I've had a transaction. I've had a transfusion, and therefore, and with his actual blood type matching on the back. Yeah, interesting.
It's completely aside, but I saw a really funny TikTok where a guy just went up to a service dog and started stroking it, and the owner of the dog said, "Please don't do that. You kind of put him off what he's doing, and you shouldn't stroke a dog without permission." And the guy went to the dog, "Is it all right if I stroke you?"
Amazing. That's amazing. What, totally legitimately thinking that's what he meant?
It looked like it, but maybe he was just playing around. But yeah, it did make me laugh either way.
There's that that Jewish comedian who tells the guy comes up to him and says, "Does your dog bite?"
Yeah.
And he no. He strokes the dog and it bites him. He said, "You said it didn't bite. That's not my dog." Yeah.
Well, moving on with a bit of this kind of predating writings that predate Dracula, the novel. In 1819, the publication of the fictional work The Vampira, a tale written by Dr. John Polidori, originally published under Lord Byron's name, much to the dismay of Dr. Polidori. We'll come back to that later because that involves something we've talked about on the podcast before, that weird holiday that Byron and his clan, whatever you want to call them, took to Geneva, I think it was, and where a lot of ghost stories and Frankenstein comes from. We'll come back to that because that is quite important in this. In 1845, the vampire made its mark on penny dreadfuls. So I'm sure all of you know they're kind of popular serialised, almost comic books of their day, weren't they, the penny dreadful? James Malcolm Rymer released a penny dreadful called, you can see why he ended up changing the title, it was called Varney the Vampire.
Oh.
Sounds like something out of Viz.
It does, yeah. Varney.
Varney the Vampire, but it was then renamed, or is also known as the Feast of Blood.
Yeah, that sounds a bit scarier.
So this character, this vampire, was a skeletal figure in a shroud, had fanged teeth. The series ran for 2 years. So I believe Penny Dreadfuls were either weekly or every 2 weeks. So for 2 years, that's amazing. So that predates Dracula.
Right, okay. And you say he's what, a skeletal figure?
Yes.
Does he have the teeth?
Had the teeth, but he was a skeleton in a shroud. We'll come on to why that might be the case when we get into a bit of Eastern European folklore. Now, also, there's a sketch by Charles Darwin of a vampire bat. Darwin caught the bat feeding on a horse while in Chile in 1832, and it was the first Western-confirmed instance of a bat sucking blood. So to a Western audience, certainly a British, that wasn't a concept until Darwin found it and did a sketch on it.
Okay.
In fact, in 1901, the first paperback edition of Bram Stoker's Dracula pictured the Count as kind of half man, half bat. So again, the implication is that was influenced by the Charles Darwin thing, and because in the book, if I'm correct, doesn't really say that Dracula turns into a bat. No. It just describes him having wings and walking down the side of the building. So I think maybe because of that Charles Darwin thing, the vampire bat then came into the folklore in a way.
But in every vampire cartoon, they turn into bats. Matt Berry's character in What We Do in the Shadows turns into a bat all the time.
Yeah.
It is a regular thing. So that's the first time a Western audience, I guess that's seeing a mammal sucking blood because we'd be familiar with insects, we'd be familiar with mosquitoes and things.
Yeah.
But they don't feel.
Well, even horseflies in this country.
Yes, horseflies give you a nasty nip, won't they?
Yeah, but a mammal, yes, exactly.
Yeah, that is much more sinister in a way.
Yeah.
Oh, I wonder whether then people had been saying, there is these, whether there was a mythology before he recorded it, the vampire bats, and that sort of went down in the same mythology as when we were talking about the tree, the man-eating trees. That
right,
sort of,
right, yeah.
Oh, yeah, there's a bat that sucks blood. Of course there is, mate. Of course there is, yeah.
Well, I highlight these examples because it seems like the vampire, a bit like Dracula changing into a bat, changed when the stories of vampirism reached the West, especially Britain. They started to morph from the East European lore into something different. Now, in Eastern European folklore and stories, the vampire was born from the graveyard, pretty much, as far as I can tell, hung out there most of the time, was a bit of a bedraggled creature in a shroud, and was much more ghoulish, not the count or aristocrat we picture today. If we go back to that image of Varney the vampire, skeletal figure in a shroud, in a graveyard, that comes very much from the East European tradition. And I'll get on to why that is in a minute.
And that is, I guess that's much more reanimated. Well, I mean, Dracula's a reanimated. Well, he's not, is he? He's the undead, whereas, I'm sort of talking myself round. Yeah, I see what you mean. But it's definitely a humanoid figure, and the implication is that this thing used to be a human at some point.
Yeah.
Right.
From my reading, in terms of a historical timeline, there's almost 3 phases to vampire folklore. There's the bit which we'll look at in a second, which was thousands of years ago, which are not quite vampire, but they involve bloodsuckers. Phase 1. Phase 2 is the Eastern European tradition, so hundreds of years ago, not thousands. And phase 3 is the westernization of the vampire legend, and out of that comes Dracula the novel.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I wonder whether the phases you're describing also are followed by the fear that people have. I mean, I guess they must be, because you're putting it into folklore. So somebody walking around at night time in the 15th century is not going to be fearful of a vampire. They're not going to feel that is upon them. But isn't it really interesting, though, that everything you're describing is a folklorian transition of a monster, but there is almost an acceptance. There is a vampire community of people who either attempt to live like vampires or claim that they really truly are. That's really unusual, because I don't think that's in terms of the sort of the cryptos and things. There aren't many people that. I mean, I suppose there might be one if you looked, but there aren't many people who live in werewolf communities claiming to be a werewolf. There's a luxurious kind of kudos that goes with being a vampire.
Well, we'll come on to some of those themes, but I think you're tapping into something that the author and I kind of took from the book. There is something about the vampire being a reanimated human and having, to some level, the appearance of a human. But vampire lore is kind of connected with werewolf lore in a way. Maybe was in a kind of next generation of the werewolf in a way. I'll get onto that. Maybe not. But before we get into that, let's look at some of these, like I said, the thousands of years ago, the things that may have influenced the next phase. So let's start with the first phase. So blood-sucking demons have haunted civilized society since at least biblical times. They're described in accounts on ancient Chaldean and Assyrian tablets. We have Lilith, who was a female demon, the first rebellious wife of Adam. In some translations of the Talmud, her name has, not correctly, but in later versions it has been translated as vampire. Lamia was a bisexual female monster of ancient Greece who drank the blood of children. The Romans were familiar with ghosts that sucked blood and brought nightmares. As the incubus and succubus comes into this a bit as well. In Norse myth, which drew on the Gothic legend, there was a character called Dracula, who was an undead being. Again, may have influenced the name of Dracula. This is a bit of a weird one if it's true. There is some doubt about whether it's true. In 1492, Pope Innocent VIII was given the blood of 3 young boys to rejuvenate him.
What, to drink or to...
Well, it's a bit unsure whether he drank the blood or it was given as a transfusion. But it's reported that all 4 died, the 3 boys and him.
Well, I'm not incredibly surprised.
No. The Hungarian Countess, Elizabeth Balthory, who died in 1614, was reputed to bathe in the blood of young girls in order to retain her youthful beauty. That's a hell of a bath, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just go to Body Shop.
Yeah.
But do you remember we did an episode on the human fascination with blood? And I think there's this, because it's obviously life-giving, it has this sort of quality of, oh, well, if I have the blood of something younger, I will be transformed into something younger. So there is a metamorphosis built into our mythology around blood, let alone the vampire itself.
Well, and that ties into consuming blood turns you into something else.
Ah, right, yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, the blood-sucking kind of cryptids or beasts are all over the world. You know, China, India, Philippines, there are stories. But our obsession with blood, generally human obsession with blood, either consuming, having it consumed, or even bathing in it, has been around for centuries.
And of course, I mean, we touched on this before, but it's part of the ceremony in the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
This is the blood of Christ, and they truly believe that wine transforms into the blood of Christ. So again, you've got that transformation thing that you were just discussing there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in this first phase, we've got lots of mythological creatures and beings who consume blood, but it's, am I right as thinking that like a sort of a proto-vampire, they're doing it to sustain themselves and it has a side effect of evil?
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good description, I think. And they vary from creatures who don't look like we would imagine a vampire to do, or not human, or not humanoid, to invisible entities, to just the value of the blood itself. Whereas phase 2, the vampire takes on more of a human connotation. So let's get on to that. So we're moving to Eastern Europe. I mean, here's a really how big this was. In the early 14th centuries, vampires made their way into the law of the land in Eastern Europe. In 14th century Serbia, Article 20 was introduced by Emperor Stefan Dusan, a law which prohibited the unlawful exhumation of those accused of being undead. Which sounds weird, but we'll get into why it's not so weird in a minute.
Yeah, grave robbing.
No.
Oh, no, okay.
No, not grave robbing, actually. The law came in as a reaction to what was becoming common practice in many villages, people exhuming bodies in order to burn or behead them, as they believed this would stop them becoming vampires. So you had this traditional route of burying the body. Wherever it came from, there became this belief that if it was going to turn into a vampire, that wasn't enough. So lots of bodies were exhumed so they could be beheaded or burnt, which, you know, the law of the land, religion, that was frowned upon, to say the least, but it became a practice. There was some interesting protection against vampires that we used at this time. Many of these may have influenced vampire law we know today. Brooke writes, protection against such creatures is possible by taking communion at the graveside and making the sign of the cross. The vampire body can also be hampered in its career by placing a crucifix or coin in its mouth. This is weird. Wedging a brick under the chin to break its teeth. severing tendons in the legs. Interesting, this next one. Laying a net in the coffin. All the knots of the net must be undone before the coffin can be vacated by the vampire.
Okay.
The next one might have some influence of inviting a vampire over the threshold. Placing earth in the coffin from your threshold or a threshold of a dwelling will protect a home. So you would put some of your earth from outside your front step into the coffin, so that means the undead wouldn't come back there.
That's interesting.
The next one. Sand or poppy seeds can act as impediments if scattered in the coffin or strewn on the path from the grave. The vampire is required to count each and every grain of sand or seed before proceeding, and in some accounts they can only do this at a rate of 1 grain or seed a year.
Well, that's just annoying for them.
Yeah, can you imagine you get out of the coffin and go, oh, come on, there's some poppy seeds or grain of sand.
Now, where does that even come from? That is such a bizarre...
I've got something even more bizarre coming up in a minute, which we're going to get to. It's not this, but... So burial face downwards is also recommended. To slay a vampire, a nail is driven through its forehead, and its head is severed and placed between its feet. Infected relatives can be treated with fresh blood. So this comes back to some of those early legends we've talked about. Joachim Vujic, in his book Travelling Through Serbia, which was released in 1827, detailed observing a priest prise a suspected vampire's mouth open with a hawthorn stick and putting holy water on its tongue. The account also details a village elder impaling the vampire through the chest with a hawthorn stick. Stake through the heart.
Familiar, yeah. And the hawthorn has holy connotations, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, yeah.
Right, yeah, because I think if I'm getting this right, there is a legend, there's a hawthorn tree in Glastonbury where Jesus threw down a staff and it turned into that tree, I believe.
Okay.
So I think that, yeah, there are lots of hawthorny type religious stuff there. But like when we've discussed vampires in the past, that I can understand the burying face down because that's sort of where they can't sit up and do the...
Yeah, harder to move.
Harder to move. And the holy water on the tongue thing, that's interesting because I wonder whether that is... Like there's loads of very practical and non-paranormal explanations for like a body gurgling or even moving. And I wonder whether that just freaked some people out and the priest was just trying to make them feel better. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting you say that because we'll get on to something which the author doesn't say explains vampires, but it struck me as a really good explanation of why we have them in this Eastern European tradition. But I'll come on to that. So in other regions like Macedonia, folklore talks about the restorative properties of vampire blood. People took the blood of the killed vampire and rubbed their bodies with it as protection against sickness, to attain good health, and to be resistant to other vampires. This reminds me a little bit of, I don't know if you've ever watched True Blood, but there is that thing of humans drinking the vampire blood. They don't turn into vampires, but it gives them incredible powers, almost like an incredible drug trip with superhuman powers.
Oh, okay. No, I haven't seen that.
Let's get on to one of the strangest things that I came across. From Slavic folklore, this was first written about by vampirologist Jean-Louis Perkowski. It was the Slavonic gypsy belief in vampiric agricultural tools and vampire vegetables.
Vampire vegetables?
I knew that'd spark your attention.
What on earth?
Let's start with the agricultural tools. A rod for tethering sheaves of wheat, for example, was said to turn vampire if kept for more than 3 years.
What does that even mean?
That if
it's
you
turn vampire, what, it literally becomes a blood-sucking...
Yeah, I don't know. That is a really good question because there's no detail of what actually happened. I couldn't work out if it was almost like one of those Japanese yokai.
That's exactly where I was going.
Or it just transforms into a kind of humanoid vampire. I don't know.
Weird, okay.
Pumpkins and watermelons took only 10 days to animate into shuddering, murmuring vampires.
Watermelons?
Yeah. And a pumpkin kept after Christmas will also become a vampire.
Well, I've got no truck with pumpkins anyway. They don't taste very nice. But,
I don't know.
That's weird.
It's so weird. And like you said, I don't know what happens, whether they turn into a human or a ghoul or, a pumpkin head. Who knows? Now, as with other historical paranormal topics we've discussed on the podcast, plague and disease played a big part in the legend of the vampire. There are lots of examples from Eastern Europe and Western ones as well, taking place with the backdrop of plague and contagion. A small number of these recorded cases involve sightings and encounters with the living dead, but most relate to that practice of exhuming buried bodies to cremate or behead them, as it was believed to be a way you destroyed or stopped them becoming vampires and claiming new victims. So, Ben, if you can imagine a scenario, this is my fantasy scenario, this starts to make logical sense, especially given the lack of understanding of contagious disease. So imagine you live in a small village and one of the villagers suddenly dies of a mystery illness. They're buried. Maybe a week later, another 2 villagers come down with the same mystery illness and die. You can see how a narrative developed that first victim may have returned to take the next 2, right? Because there's no realisation that the damage or the invisible infection could have been done when all involved were still alive, right?
Absolutely.
You've got no comprehension or understanding of that, have you?
No, there's no understanding of viruses or bacteria either.
Yeah.
Hence, when we spoke about it during the plague episode, the plague doctors having the nose piece full of sweet-smelling items, cloves, that sort of thing, because they thought that the smell carried the disease. So it's perfectly rational. I mean, of course, part of this, part of the legend that we think we know is that it's STDs as well.
Yeah.
And it's an allegory for STDs too. I suppose both can be true at the same time.
Yeah, well, it's been an allegory for lots of diseases. But you can see how that misunderstanding, that belief, translates into them exhuming the bodies to dispose of them in a way that they believed prevented them becoming a vampire, the burning and beheading.
Yeah.
Now, many accounts of this time create the folklore that vampires would consume their own flesh to survive in the grave, which I'd not come across before.
No.
And I wondered if that could be some misinterpretation of a decomposing body.
I was going to say that sounds like decomposing, but also because when bodies are decomposing, they have this this fresh blood look around the lips, don't they?
Yeah.
Which is where some people believe that they're coming out at night and feasting. So if you look in a grave and they've got fresh blood and they've also lost some bits of their flesh, perfect. Yeah, they've eaten themselves.
But in a way, like Varney, the vampire, that feels much more ghoulish, doesn't it? Paranormal entity than human-like.
Yeah.
But there are a considerable number of accounts that describe some exhumed bodies looking human-like, looking alive, not decomposing, albeit a bit pale. This is incredible. Many cases describing liquid blood still running through their veins or bleeding out of them. So this is the heart of this kind of human vampire lore.
And is there an explanation for that? There must be.
There is, and it's quite a scary one. Possible explanation. This is what I was talking about earlier.
Oh, what, they were buried alive? Ah.
This made me think about, there's an incredible fact that's later in the book where Broom talks about premature burial.
Ah, and the Victorian grave bells.
Yes, let me get on to that, actually, because that's what I'm getting on to. This next fact then just stuck with me, and I can't stop thinking about it. So under an ordinance of 1829 to deter premature burial, the New York...
Just deter it.
Well, you'll see what I mean. The New York dead was stored in their coffins for 8 days above ground, their heads exposed and with little alarm bells attached to their hands and feet. This is going to blow you away. Out of the 1,200 corpses retained in this way, apparently 6 of the dead returned to life, suggesting the premature burial rate was as high as 1 in 200.
Oh, my life. And those 6 people, did they recover?
Yeah. Well, some of them did.
Oh, my goodness.
So, Ben, that was in 1829. That's 100 years after the events that solidified vampire lore in Eastern Europe. So I thought if 1 in 200 people in 1829 were buried before they were actually dead, you have to think the numbers would have been considerably higher in the 16th and 1700s, right?
Yeah.
In fact, this amazing thing, Bram Stoker researched that New York survey on premature burial while writing Dracula.
Ah, right, okay. Yeah, it's a good story piece. I mean, I can see how some of that was incorporated into what he did. But yeah, that is...
So if we go back to my East European village that I fantasised about,
yeah,
it's possible, even likely, that as the villagers were exhuming bodies, they would occasionally come across someone who was still alive, or barely clinging on to life, or had just passed. It would explain cases of exhumed bodies that hadn't decayed, or still had liquid blood in their veins or coming out of their body.
Scratches on the top of the coffin as well, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I thought about the nets that had to undo. You can see why that came about, because that could have come from that. It's funny, because it might explain there's a Serb and Slovak belief that the vampire possesses ruby cheeks rather than the look of the dead. In fact, these cultures often describe blushing-cheeked drinkers as being red as a vampire.
Gosh. Wow, okay. I mean, I have read about this, as I said before, like the some corpses can appear flushed. So this is very much, this is people's beliefs, and it must have been, because I do know that it's only relatively recently, and even now the definition of death, it can change, and it's not necessarily completely locked. But back then, when presumably people did, I mean, they knew enough maybe to check with a mirror or listen to a heart, whatever, but that idea that they could be dead is they could be alive, is too horrible to comprehend. So,
but I think your point you made earlier, did they come back to life? I would have thought that is an incredibly small percentage.
Small, yeah.
But there would have been a lot of people who would have died who were just buried too early.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So you could go back to exhume the body 2 weeks later, and they could have literally passed away the day before, technically. Didn't mean they would survive, but they would then give you this appearance of, hold on, they've not decayed, they've not aged, they've got blood in their veins.
Yeah.
Well, in Britain in the 17th century, blood was also metaphorically on everyone's lips. You're not going to like this next fact, Ben. I never knew this. In 1656, the architect Christopher Wren pioneered hypodermic injections by intoxicating his dog with wine injected straight into its veins.
Oh, for God's sake, why is it always the dog?
Always the dog. The diarist Samuel Pepys discussed blood transfusions between dogs in 1666, reflecting that there might be many benefits for humans. Let's move on to the 17th and 18th century. And I think Nick Broom in his book sums it up pretty well. He said, in the early 18th century, the traditional bloodsuckers of Eastern European folklore came face to face with the empirical science and became vampires. They were identified less as supernatural bloodsuckers and more as nocturnal asphyxiators and or as vectors for contagious disease. and they were a notable physical phenomenon, corporeal, tangible, flesh and blood, and exhibiting particular dietary requirements. But even the skeptics had to agree that although vampires may not exist per se as prodigies of the natural world, they were nevertheless at least evidence of mass hysteria, psychological disturbance or hallucinations. Vampires, then, did not exist until the emerging medical profession and natural philosophers began to try and explain them, and they were thus named and categorised as vampires.
Okay. I guess there's all sorts of things happening at that time. So he's saying that this societal change which is happening because people are accepting science and sort of not going so much on folklore. I guess it's maybe science and Christianity that is overruling.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I mean, Dracula is very much a science-based monster, isn't he, when you think about it?
Yeah.
And then when you go to a book which comes much later but is much earlier than you think, which is I Am Legend, where although they are zombies, there is an actual virus that's infecting people.
Yeah.
This is all coming from a position of knowledge rather than just
investigation.
Fear. Yeah. It has a lot of similarities to what we were talking about with the spiritualist movement becoming measured by cameras and such.
Yeah.
As these things come in, people's old beliefs go away, and it becomes perhaps something more that you scare the children with to make them go to bed, rather than something you're actually scared of, or but you would tell the stories perhaps as an interesting amusement rather than you need to be aware of this. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a bit about in the 18th century, investigation of vampire cases were often conducted by medical scientists working in the field.
Oh, really?
So, you know what I mean? It wasn't in that sense, it wasn't a paranormal religious thing.
Right.
It was a scientific thing.
So maybe there was a feeling that there was a virus or something that caused it.
Yeah, there was. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
I mean, there is a early case that was reported in Croatia in 1672. A dead man named Jure Grando rose from his grave as a restless corpse and visited his neighbours. So again, I wondered if that could have been somebody who'd managed to been buried early and got out.
Wait, so in that story, what, his neighbours see him come back?
Yeah, he comes to their house.
And why do they think that it's a vampire rather than a ghost? Is it because...
It's human.
But a ghost is human too.
But yes, but you could see a scenario where it looked the person looks exactly like they did the day they left. They're there. You know, there's nothing...
Maybe it's the solidity of the being that makes them think that it's not a ghost.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's just what they thought of. Maybe they're just reporting... Did it try to bite them? Is that come up?
I don't know. I'm going to go... Some of these cases, I'm not going to go into much detail here because I'm going to come back to them in another episode because they're fascinating and I can't do them justice here. But I hope it wasn't a case of somebody being buried early and managed to get himself out of the grave, because he was dealt with by a priest performing an exorcism who then attempted to stake him with a hawthorn and finally decapitated him.
Oh, lordy. Right. Yeah. That's pretty bad to be buried alive and then have that happen. But if he was alive, did he not go, no, I'm still alive?
That's what you would say, wouldn't you? Tricksterous spirit.
But wouldn't you say that and then you go, it's not going to bite you? But yeah, okay. Yeah.
Well, again, I would have thought, if we go, I'm not saying that's what happened, but if we go with our story that it was an alive person who managed to get out, buried early, and managed to get back out again, the trauma and distress that you would have gone through, you know, you might feel like you were some crazy rabid entity, mightn't you? Might be easy to perceive it. You're not gonna chip up going, you'll never guess what happened to me.
No.
There were further incidents in 1689. There were activities in Poland and Russia in 1693 and 1694. There were notices in journals, like kind of big academic journals. There were reports from Prussia in 1710 and 1721. In 1718, on the old Hungarian-Polish border, a merchant named Kasparek rose from the dead, and further cases were reported in Hungary and Transylvania in the 1720s. I mean, like I said, there is a lot of cases that I don't have time to do justice to, but, you know, thankfully, the book, Nick Broom's book, has such a big list of references that I thought it'd be good to delve into the more particular cases on another occasion, do some more research. So exploration of all these cases and events were gaining prominence in the West and were a serious subject of discussion. 12 books and 4 dissertations on vampirism appeared in 1732. Over the next 3 years, a further 22 academic papers were published in European cultural and intellectual centres such as Amsterdam, Leipzig and Vienna. Vampires were becoming a Western phenomenon, with the phrase a vampire working its way into everything. I guess if it were now, at the time, the word vampire would have been contender for word of the year in the dictionary.
Really? It's that prolific?
It became an insult to describe everyone from literary agents to politicians. They're a vampire.
Oh, we still do that to an extent.
Yeah. So it came into... common parlance, let's say, if that's the right phrase.
Yeah, and it becomes, a derogatory term for somebody that's trying to take something that you believe is yours. The tax man is a vampire. Yeah, I see, yeah.
Yeah, so that is another theme that Broom talks about. Actually, the vampire is more, in Western terms, about consumerism and, almost capitalism has been used as an analogy for that. But this trend of vampires being blamed for outbreaks of disease was big and continued alongside other more general fears. Taking drugs like opium could turn you into a vampire, it was said. There were connections that were made between outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and vampires. This is nuts. In 1750, Paris, a rumour circulated that Louis XV had kidnapped children and stolen their blood to cure his and or his daughter's leprosy. It led to riots where at least 20 people were killed.
Good Lord.
Yeah. Now, there's some interesting parts of the book that highlight how difficult it was for religion to get its head around vampire lore, which does have themes, as we've already talked about, of resurrection, consuming, in those early iterations, the flesh and the power of consuming blood. They're very religious, they at least embodied that. Vampires were tangible, Broom writes, the physical risen dead. So vampirism was deliberately avoided by Protestant theologians, who are in any case increasingly fascinated by intangible phenomena. Vampirism, seemingly engineered by the devil and his demonic minions, smacked too much of Catholic superstition, which is one of the reasons why in Britain it became historicalised as ancient legend and dark folklore rather than acknowledged as the uncomfortably modern phenomenon it really was. The church, in some ways, didn't want it, or wanted to paint it as something ancient, but it wasn't. It was something new.
Oh, because, okay, yes, I can understand why they would do that, yes.
So also, why later accounts of measures for dealing with vampires drew on archaic customs in an attempt to confine them to the Catholic past. Catholic theologians found themselves, he says, in a deadly difficult embrace with vampires. Vampires consequently tested the difference in thinking within the Christian church by presenting a challenge to both the Protestant and the Catholic creeds and the logic of their thought. Rationalising vampirism by explaining away the supernatural entities therefore risked undermining the spiritual foundation of faith, but then treating vampires as magical and malignant demons disturbed the supremacy of God over the devil. In this precise no man's land between sacred faith and secular rationalism, the vampire found a congenial habitat, he says. So it's a lovely way of phrasing it.
Yeah, it is. It is. And that makes me understand more that this sort of this idea of different bits of the law coalescing into something that is similar yet different.
Congealing, even.
Congealing, yeah. And in a way, it is significantly less frightening than the earlier ones because it's sanitized, isn't it?
Yeah, tangible, weirdly, is a word that's coming to me.
Yeah, tangible, yeah.
Well, these themes and the vampire's increasing cultural relevance during a time of disease and hardship, in conjunction with the fact that these vampiric creatures could somehow cheat death, meant they started to make their way more prominently into art and literature. You can see why artists got obsessed with them, right?
Yeah.
The first poem in English dedicated to the vampire was probably The Dead Men of Pest, written in 1807 by John Herman Merivale, who was part of Lord Byron's circle of friends. And my reading of it is Byron and his friends became kind of obsessed with vampires. You can see why they liked them. And this was most notable during their famous trip, which we've talked about before, to Geneva, where everyone present was presented the challenge to write a ghost story. And of course, the most famous work to come out of that event was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which many say leans heavily on the themes of vampire lore.
Yeah.
That holiday also inspired John William Polidori to write a short story called The Vampira, which was, as I said, initially published under Lord Byron's name. And that may have started the trend, or at least enhanced the vampire's reputation as a sexual entity. And this is basically the history of the vampire pre-Bram Stoker's novel. So let's close by looking into Dracula and the impact it has had. Now, according to Nick Broom, Dracula, first published in 1897, has had a seismic influence. Indeed, it is no exaggeration to suggest that vampirology after Dracula, I like this, AD, he calls it.
Oh, nice, yeah.
will never fully escape the clutches of Stoker's iconic text. Dracula is the climax of over 70 years of vampire tales, themselves predated by a further century of attested reports, reasoned theory, and systematic debate. And although in its wake, Dracula would be relentlessly reworked in thousands of ways, not only in literature, but also on the big screen and the small screen, on stage, on the catwalk, as well as by the late 20th century Goths and the early 21st century emos, the novel remains a remarkable document of state-of-the-art 1890s vampirology. Indeed, the Dracula that was first published in 1897, he says, is an uncanny novel, familiar today through its multiform variations and deviations, but also unexpectedly strange and curious, grounded in the rich blood and deep soil of darker understanding of corporeal matter, spiritual mystery, and social havoc. The Dracula is a perturbing entity that brings us face to face with the inevitable horror from which we cannot escape, the horror of being here now. Now, Ben, what I didn't fully appreciate is how much work and research Stoker put into his iconic novel. He spent several years researching, drafting, and redrafting the narrative. And he incorporated many aspects of vampire lore, such as slaying the vampires by staking or beheading or cremation. He was influenced by some of the reported cases of vampire encounters, which I will return to at another point, even weaving bits of them into the narrative. There's a really interesting interview that Bram Stoker did for British Weekly, where he talks about the connection between vampires and premature burial, which I found fascinating. He says, it rested, I imagine, on some case such as this. A person may have fallen into a death-like trance and been buried before their time. Afterwards, the body may have been dug up and found alive, and from this a horror seized upon people, and in their ignorance they imagined that a vampire was about.
Yeah, I understand.
So Stoker also played on the themes that had continued to influence the folklore, especially in Britain: regional identity, politics, medicine, natural history. Another interesting influence may have been the hysteria around Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In 1888, the Lyceum Theatre in London had to cut short its stage adaptation of Jekyll and Hyde after rumours that it was inspiring Jack the Ripper to commit his murders.
Oh.
Bram Stoker was manager of the Lyceum Theatre at the time.
I knew that he was the manager of the theatre. Ah, okay, so he
later claimed that Jack the Ripper was a source for Dracula, and the Count is ultimately classified as a Lambrosian criminal type who can be intellectually outwitted through deductive reasoning. So there was some influence of Jack the Ripper in it. Ironically, obviously, Jack the Ripper was never caught, but...
Yes, okay.
Another fascinating fact that I didn't know.
Yeah.
Another influence on Bram Stoker's Dracula may have come from one of my favourite books, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Ah, because he's forever young.
Yes. Oscar Wilde's book was first published in 1890 as Stoker began work on Dracula. The author Broom writes, Wilde's exploration of the symbiotic relationship between the ageless, incorruptible and vampiric Dorian and his ever-changing, rotting and shrouded image may have influenced Stoker's Count Dracula. Stoker had not only known Wilde, a fellow Irishman, for years, but had married Florence Balcombe, who had previously partnered Wilde. Dorian Gray becomes a wraith because he is both all image and, like the vampire, lacks a true image. Instead, as one of the characters said of his living portrait, he becomes a thing.
Yeah. There's a dehumanization.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. In the book, the Count is built up to have obviously been pretty brutal in life.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
But that isn't always... Okay, sorry, I'm sort of rambling here now because I'm I'm pulling all the threads together in my head. But it's interesting that when he becomes the vampire, his overwhelming thing is... So he was fascinated with blood before, but he becomes more fascinated with blood because he needs it to live. And that becomes the driving force. And I think that is the kind of the scary thing about him as a character, that his driving force is for him to stay alive, and for him to stay alive, you sort of have to die or become a vampire yourself.
Which kind of explains that connection with consumerism and, consumerism and capitalism to a degree. I mean, there's a bit in the book where he talks about Karl Marx using the term vampire or vampiric in terms of capitalism. Yeah. And
interestingly, of course, the premise of the book is that the Count is actually undertaking a legal property transaction. He's employed a lawyer.
Yeah. Well, that's that shift between the creature that would hang around the graveside and claw its way out of a coffin to something becoming more aristocratic.
Yeah.
So again, Broom writes about that in this book, saying, he was a consumer, he was an aristocrat, he was in the legal profession. There's all that connection of or interest in legal things. Wanting to be part of society. It's like, you can say, and that it's got that connotation of vampiric.
Yeah, and he wants to do everything correctly, which is always the big. I think when you first read it, that is the surprise. Like, he pays for everything and buys everything. He's not a thug. He doesn't just barge his way through. He does it properly, which is as terrifying, if not more terrifying, than doing it the other way.
Let's quickly, before I sum up, let's talk about sex.
Okay.
Now,
salt and pepper. Yeah, it is salt and pepper, isn't it?
Yeah. Baby. I'm not calling you baby. Broom makes an interesting point about the sexualization of vampires, given that though you can see themes around sexual desire, sexuality and oppression in Stoker's novel, they seem to have become much more pronounced, right? He said, the whole nature of the vampire, he says, has been rewritten as a productive sadomasochistic sexual fantasy appealing to every kink and sex crime. There are only hints of this in the history of the vampire, but just as the vampire was supernaturalized in the early 19th century, so in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was forcefully sexualized. He blames the psychologist Sigmund Freud, the pioneering sexologist Richard von Kraftenbing, and cinema, basically, because the story and that sexual element did lend itself to early cinema. He makes a really good point about those early black and white movies. It makes me think of Nosferatu, the original 1922. The appearance of the vampire, you know, the dark clothing versus the white face, and all of it lent itself to the black and white cinema image in a perfect way. And it's interesting hearing about the new version of Nosferatu. It's not black and white, but it's shot in a way where the colours are so reduced, it's almost black and white.
Right, interesting.
He said vampires on screen were agents of forbidden desire, and as such were eagerly embraced in the next century. Hammer Film Productions in particular identified a demand for schlock horror movies, he calls them, which I think is a bit of an insult, which became a marketable aspect of the 1960s sexual revolution. Since then, vampires have tended to be lustful, depraved and super sexy, models of transgression, avatars of forbidden fantasy, and fallen angels of the death drive. But this is a recent reworking, and there is little of it in Dracula. As I've suggested, when it comes to desire, Dracula is much more focused on the fetishization of commodities, which is a bit about your perfectionism you're talking about as well, makes me think.
Yeah.
Where does this leave us? So maybe I started to think maybe folklore of the vampire is not the correct term, given it is a relatively recent phenomena. In this, I really wanted to focus on this period pre-Bram Stoker's Dracula. And there's so much in the book, I've only really covered, to use a pun, a bite-sized version today. The amount of research that's gone into it is incredible.
So can we come back and look at some of those stories another time?
We definitely will. I think the main things I take away from this process of reading the book and putting this together is the legend and the lore runs before and much deeper than the post-Dracula era, but it's hundreds of years rather than thousands, right?
Right.
The way the legend has been used or maybe absorbed many themes as a metaphor, disease, science, capitalism, consumerism, sexuality, I think is fascinating. That, you know, maybe we do get the vampire each kind of individual culture wants or needs. The thought that the legend may have grown due to premature burial has just blown my mind. I think that's both chilling and absolutely fascinating, because I'd never really considered that before. I mean, it's logical when you think of it now, but 1 in 200 in the 1800s, that's incredible. Buried early.
Yeah. No, that is incredible and terrifying. Yeah.
But I think the main thing I've mulled over since reading the book is why culturally we're so obsessed with the vampire. I kind of feel we're a bit more, as a society, not me and you, but as a society, perhaps more wider than other paranormal beings or topics. And Nick Broom does explore this in the book. My reading of it is, because the vampire has a human form, we can directly relate to it. So in a way, it's not so much supernatural. It's more of a supernatural human. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Mix that with the ability of the creature to conquer death. It gives it an allure, glamour, if you like, to kind of use a vampire phrase. Broom makes this point, and I think he's right. There's something about it being relatable in that way, but also being part of the extremes of society. It can do things we might like to do in our darkest moments, or at least those extremes that we're fascinated by. he makes a connection in the book, actually, which has stuck with me as well, that the lore of the vampire could be similar to our society's current obsession with serial killers and true crime, which looks into this, ties into that, looking at things on the extreme of our society, the fascination with that. And that got me thinking, because this book was written, I think, 2018. I thought, I don't know what you think, I thought a good example of this could be the current obsession with Luigi Mangione, who recently killed the CEO of Unity Healthcare in New York.
Yes.
So on the face of it, Mangione had committed a cold, bloody murder. But like the vampire lore, it's tapped into a number of the themes I just mentioned. It tapped into those themes of social injustice and unrest, someone operating on the edge of society. And like a vampire, Mangione himself has taken on an allure, a glamour. You know what I mean? There are petitions for him to be released, you know? So I don't know where I'm going with that, but I've just pictured like, wow, Mangione in a way is like a vampire.
I think people are seeing him as striking against something which is causing inequality in their own lives.
Yeah.
And there might be something of that in the vampire for sure. I mean, there is an element of, in the original story, in the original Dracula, there's almost an incel-like nature to the way that he's pursuing Mina.
Yeah.
And that is obviously a dark desire, which, you know, that has rolled on to some of the shows that we've spoken about recently.
But maybe it works better, my connection there, with more modern Dracula vampire folklore. I'm thinking True Blood, like you said, Twilight. Those characters are cool. The humans want to kind of almost be them.
Oh, I see. Yes.
Maybe it makes more sense in that context rather than the Bram Stoker. So maybe it's more of a 21st century. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Well, look, we'll definitely return to some of those East European cases because there's a lot of research material to go through there. If you're interested in reading more, Nick Broom's book is called The Vampire, A New History. In the UK, the paperback is about £12, Kindle version for a tenner. He's also written many other books on Gothic and other topics. So, yeah, really fascinating. I thought it was really well written and the amount of research is incredible.
That was a great exploration so far. I'm looking forward to those stories.
Yeah, me too.
And because you keep talking about Eastern Europe, all I can think about is a Hugo Zastava travelling around the darkened roads and seeing a flash of a tooth with a splash of blood on it and trying to make a quick getaway in the 19 horsepower yellow car.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to work, especially if it's got wings.
And also, there's something in the back of my mind. I'm going to look at it after when you talked about the that vampire in the Penny Dreadfuls. I'm sure someone has done Vinny the Vampire.
Okay.
Does that ring a bell with you, Vinny the Vampire?
I don't know. I don't know if you just put that into my head as a kind of planted memory.
I can't remember if it was a TV series or... I'm going to look that up, but Vinny the Vampire definitely comes up in somewhere. He's kind of like a non-evil vampire. We'll look into that.
Maybe Varney was a much cooler name back in those days, but can you imagine it now? It's like, I've come up with this brilliant comic book series. He's this dark character of the grave who goes and sucks blood. And sounds great. What's it called? Varney the Vampire.
Like Billy the Kid.
Yeah.
Like maybe he shouldn't have double-barreled to Varney the Vampire. He should have been like... he should have had a gothic surname.
Yeah.
And then he would have sounded more evil. That was brilliant. I can't wait to come back for more. Genuinely, like, you've made all of the atoms in my cranial structure reassemble themselves in some kind of quantum mechanical wave.
Glad to be of service.
Thank you. Patreon.com/TQM pod is where you want to find out more about us, get our shows early and without adverts. and also get extra content and join in with the community and help us with our endeavours. And I hope that we aren't vampires when we remind you to go and do that.
Yeah.
With that, it is time for us to return to our own...
Go back to our coffins.
Go back to our coffins, yeah.
We'll see you next week.
Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.
Are you the quantum mechanics?